Hi everyone. Um, good to see some people. I know we might have not as many quite as normal with the weather being so good this evening. So yeah, thanks for joining us. We're joined this evening by Ben Brown. Ben Brown, who's a physiologist, currently works with GB Paralympic Swimming and works with Liverpool John Moores University as well. Got his PhD in sports physiology, and yeah, we are lucky enough to be joined by him this evening for a seminar on stress recovery balance in road cycling. Something that's obviously really important for people that wanting to make gains in their training, and also avoid fatigue and yeah, overload in training, which sometimes in endurance sport seems to come about sometimes more often than we'd all wish. So yeah, it's going to be a good evening. So yeah, just to say we're recording this and sticking it on YouTube, so just so everyone's aware. So yeah, over to you, Ben.
Thanks, Alex. Kudos to you all for joining on a sunny evening. I've just mentioned to Alex, all of the neighbours that I can see out my window have all got barbecues going, so I don't know whether we're fools for being here doing virtual stuff or whether it's a very smart thing indeed. But hopefully, I can share some insights with you which are useful. That is the main aim. It's not a particularly long presentation, because Alex mentioned as well that with a few of these other presentations you've had, that it's quite important to have that time for questions at the end. So if you've got questions which come up as we go along, throw them in the chat if that's a way of doing it. But then also I think we'll have that time at the end for people to shout out if they have anything they want to ask. And this is a topic which I've chosen, which is stress recovery balance in road cycling. It's very closely related to what I've spent a long time at university studying, but also what I apply. So we'll get onto that stuff. But in the role of applied physiology, this is one of the, physiologically a very, very big question. And if you can crack it, you'll do very well. I mentioned for questions that you can shoot them in the chat. Also, I've got my email address there and Twitter as well. You can always message us with any questions after this, whenever they come into your head. So I'm more than happy to help out. So this is where I picked up this information which I'll be sharing with you. I held pretty much eternal student status at Liverpool John Moores University until quite recently. I had a very unimaginative university career of doing my undergraduate, master's and PhD all in the same place, but that gave us a really good opportunity to become embedded there and work with quite a few athletes through the labs and learn quite a lot. From there, I've also worked, as I do currently, at the English Institute of Sport, and more recently have started my own business with Superless Cycling to coach. And a lot of that time over the last 10 years has been looking at this idea of stress recovery balance. So in the bottom left corner, that's what I've spent a lot of my time in a dark room for the best part of 10 years, looking at heart scans of cyclists and looking at the question, what happens when you train, especially to the heart? What happens when you overtrain, particularly again with the heart? But all along this time, you pick up the other side of things and you're relating what happens in the heart to what happens with performance on the bike, what happens to important stuff like mood state. You can't really go out and give your best performance if your well-being and your mood state is really affected by the amount of exercise and amount of cycling that you're doing. So yeah, a lot of time spent in a dark room using the same technology that you use to do baby scans, but looking at the heart instead. And that threw up quite a lot of different opportunities to work in different sort of research capacities or applied capacities with these different organizations, where I've learned a huge amount from. And again, the idea is to take some of that and share it with you guys who are in your most formative, really important years, where you can hopefully get these things right and benefit from them in terms of where you go within cycling. So the questions really which I've tried to pitch for this this presentation. How do ride duration and intensity influence stress? And that's the word that we'll look at. How does recovery opportunity influence short and long-term performance on the bike? And then how can stress and recovery balance be measured and optimized within your training? Big questions in 3 short bullet points. Can't guarantee that we'll have them absolutely nailed by the end of this, but at least they'll start ruminating in your brain. You can start considering these questions. Because with cycling, you spend a lot of your time dedicated to doing it. You might as well understand the processes that you're undergoing as you go through that. So if anyone can tell me which film this quote comes from, I'd be incredibly pleased, because I've had it stuck in my head for a while and it's very, very relevant to this stuff and I have no idea where it comes from. But the idea is if you want to make an omelette, you're going to have to break some eggs. And it works very neatly with supercompensation theory, which is really the basis of training. And I don't know how familiar this is with people. I know it appears in some BC manuals, and it might be something that you've come across, even if you're studying at school at different stages. As a kind of overall theory, it makes quite a lot of sense in that you go out for a ride on the bike. Let's say you've got an interval session. You're applying stress to the body, which is doing in some ways is doing damage. You'll then get this fatigue phase where your performance decreases as a result of the damage that you've just done through training. But the reason that you've gone through that is because then in the recovery phase, hopefully you'll get a super compensation and you'll be able to do more next time you go on the bike. And we're talking about it in a session by session sort of way in that sense. But the stress that you apply, it's not like every bike ride has the same stress attached to it. The session that you're doing will link very, very closely to how deep that fatigue phase is and how much of a recovery phase that requires in order to achieve supercompensation. In other words, letting your body literally build the new mechanisms that it needs to be better next time you do it. And so when you train, you've got egg breakers to keep with that terminology. And there are a lot of different things happening in the body when you train. And they'll all be related to duration of the exercise and intensity of the exercise. And you've got, on the left-hand side, you've got the things which are systemic. So your whole body will be affected, and that will be endocrine functions. So your hormones will express differently after you've trained. You've got neuromuscular fatigue, so that works on both a local and a systemic level. If you try and tell your muscle to do something after you've been on the bike for 5 hours, your muscle will have a very different response. The different sort of path between your brain and your muscle is affected by that training, the amount of duration that you've worked through. I mentioned before a lot, and I'm very biased towards this particular one, but cardiac fatigue. It's often underappreciated because it's a difficult thing to actually visualize, but your heart is very much affected, and the efficiency of your heart working as a muscle is affected by the amount of work that you've done on the bike. Then on a more local level, you've got glycogen depletion, so literally the fuel stores in your muscles will be run a bit lower. You've got less fuel to utilize. Inflammation as well affecting the muscle, and muscle damage itself. So muscle damage, not a huge one on the bike, but there will be to some level. And also it's very likely that strength forms a part of your program within cycling. You have to consider how the muscle damage that you do through strength training is going to translate to the bike and the recovery that it needs in order to make sure that you're actually benefiting, rather than getting caught with too short of a recovery phase before you do the next session, the next phase, and so on. Then you should have, it should say omelette makers at the top, but it actually still says egg breakers for some reason. So these are the important ones. These are the omelette makers. These are the good bits. Oh no, sorry, it's focusing in just on duration as an aspect of egg breakers. So this is still looking at the fatigue phase and how deep that fatigue phase is going to be. And it's just really a practical way to think of it. If you think about if you've had a bit of time off the bike and you come back to training in sort of November, December time, and you might find that a 3-hour ride is really fatiguing and quite difficult at that stage. By the time you get to February, if you're looking at a camp situation in February, the same 3-hour ride will feel much, much easier. And what's happened there is you've built up the hardware in your body to deal with that stress. So that duration fatiguing effect on the body has changed as a result of how you've adapted. And then intensity, there's another way of determining how deep you're going to go in that fatigue phase. And so with my coaching, I use a 3 heart rate zone method to keep things as simple as possible. These are 2 rides of very similar duration, but obviously one of them is at very low aerobic intensity, and one of them has a massive threshold emphasis. Similar duration of ride, going to take a very different toll on the body in terms of the fatigue that it creates. And that's just worth noting that, you know, a 2.5 hour ride is not just a 2.5 hour ride, it's the content of that ride that's really going to have the impact. There we go. Now we've got omelette makers. So really simple. I think a lot of the time looked at as a sports scientist, as a physiologist, expected to push all the fancy cherry on top stuff like the ice baths, the compression socks, the electrical muscle stimulation devices, all of this. But if you get sleep, nutrition, and the amount of time between sessions nailed, those are going to be the absolute biggest building blocks that you can put in place to super compensate and to improve your ability on the bike. And really the cherry on top stuff is exactly that. Cherry on top stuff, generally backed with a big marketing budget rather than big impact. It's worth focusing in much more on making sure that you've got a nice, cool, dark sleeping environment over something like a compression garment or something along those lines. Paying attention to those bits is really going to increase the rate at which you adapt to training. And that theory that we've looked at so far is on a session by session basis, but a training phase, even a season, is just an extension of that. And it's looking at that stress recovery response repeated over and over again within a microcycle, within a training week, within a training phase of 3-4 weeks, and within a season. So if you look at each of these, let me see, each of these little men on bikes, and you think of that as that's a training session, that stress that creates is going to create a fatigue response, and you're going to get this subsequent recovery phase and hopefully super compensation. So at the time when we hit this person with a second session, if they've appropriately recovered, super compensated, hit them again, recover, and you end up with this wavy upward trajectory where over time you increase your capacity and you've got more performance to utilize on the bike. If you end up hitting, you know, for whatever reason, if you are under recovered by the time that second session arrives, then it's going to send you into a deeper fatigue response. And then if you do it again, you end up on this wavy response negatively. And that's where you're looking at states of sort of overreaching. Overtraining is quite rare, but cycling is one of the sports where you generally see it because the training hours that you can tolerate, because it's not an impact sport, are so high that you could be on this wavy downward trajectory for quite a long period of time. And it could be down to a few different things. It's if you're not getting enough sleep, if you're not refueling appropriately between sessions, or even if there's just not enough time between the sessions, i.e. you're trying to do more than your body can respond to, then you end up on this downward wavy trajectory. And there are some training philosophies that work on that and hope that you get a subsequent big super compensation at the end when you take the time to rest and recover. But far more consistently successful are these responses where you've got the appropriate balance of this stress and recovery, where you're getting the next session just in time to hit the peak of that wave, hit the peak of the wave the next time through, and you get that upward trajectory over time. So now if we consider actually how great is an abstract theory, let's make sure we do the right thing and we get the right amount of stress and we get the right amount of recovery. But they are very abstract theories and it's very individual. So you can't apply the same thing across the board and assume that you'll get the same response. It has to be individualized. And the best way to do that isn't just to look at performance. It isn't just to look at how your mood state is and how your well-being, how you feel in response to your training and recovery. All your physiological responses, each of those are interesting in isolation, but not that meaningful until you put them together. And this is just a few ways that I put them together in my practice. There are more complex ways, there are simpler ways, and we can discuss each of those in questions at the end, I suppose. But as a starting point, physiological responses, that's sort of my area that I spend a lot of time in. And that's resting physiology is important. So it's become a lot more accessible recently to look at your resting physiology in a standardized sort of way. So when you wake up in the morning, that's the best opportunity to get a standardized view of what physiological state your body is in. And one of the ways of doing that is look at heart rate variability and just resting heart rate. And this gives you an assessment of your autonomic nervous system. And you tend to get a healthy body has two different parts of the autonomic nervous system, and they'll be nicely balanced out with each other. If you start to get unbalanced through the too much training, or even if you're not enough training, you're undertrained, you'll tend to get dominance of one of those, and it will start to show with a change in heart rate variability and resting heart rate. And in order to make this as usable as possible, the best thing that I can suggest is if you just look at the resting heart rate side with, I'm assuming most people have a heart rate monitor available they'll be using it on the bike. If you track it over time, you can just see, you can eyeball, oh, that's an unusual figure that I get for resting heart rate, or it's within normal sort of recognizable range. And if you get a couple of days, 3 days on the bounce where you've got a real change from what you'd consider as a normal resting heart rate for you, then start to think about the context. Right, well, what's happened with training in the last few days? Another one which I mentioned at the end is this is a stress recovery balance. Training stress is just one element of stress. That can also come in from a lot of different areas of life, whether it's relationships, work responsibilities, education responsibilities, that sort of thing. You have to consider all of that context, because all of that is stress acting on the body, and the body has one sort of response to stress, whether it is training or otherwise. So that's one way to look at resting in physiology. The other is exercise response. And this is something which has become a lot easier recently with more time and money invested in indoor trainers, Zwift, for example. It's really easy to do a standardized warm-up and to find some meaning in it. And again, if you have a standardized step warm-up as part of your indoor session that you do once a week, then you can start to see if there's a difference between that effort you're having to put in to power that you're getting out. And as a very loose guide, if your heart rate is 8-10 beats or more out for the same power that you do the week before, or your normal sort of power, then something's going on there. and it's better to catch that early and back off intensity, back off duration and the overall training load early rather than wait until you get into that hole that we're talking about. So those are two quite simple ways that we can look at physiological responses to training. Performance is an obvious one, and this is some work that I did which was associated with PhD, didn't end up being actually part of PhD work, but where participants were in a training phase and they carried out a series of time trials on a weekly basis, which is part of the problem, which I'll come back to in a minute. But you can just, each of the bars represents the power out, the average power output that they achieved for an 8-minute time trial, and you can see pretty clearly the progression of this overload training. Week 1, 2, and 3, there's a shift from their sort of baseline to, okay, it's down, but it's still within a reasonable range that you could expect to see in an individual from week to week, to absolutely through the floor. And then in this particular, I've picked out one subject in particular on this because case studies are interesting. This subject then super compensated with a week of really reduced training and just felt a lot fresher and was able to put out actually their best time trial performance out of the 4-week phase. The problem which comes with that immediately is, okay, if you want to find out about your performance, to get a reliable gauge of performance, it needs to be a maximal effort. If you're sat there thinking, maybe I'm on the edge of doing too much intensity, maybe too much duration, just too much stress in total, throwing maximal efforts into the mix probably isn't going to solve that problem. If it's something you're monitoring anyway, so let's say if you have a weekly criterium race, there are probably bits of that you can take out and just compare week to week. So if it's something like a 1-minute power, and again, you're going to have variability week to week, but you can start to look at over time, see what's the normal variability week to week, to, oh, okay, well, I was at max heart rate here or max effort here, and power's actually really down. Maybe I need a bit of extra rest and recovery. It's worth saying that these were all genuine max effort time trials, and to see a change of nearly 400 watts down to sort of nearly 40 watts shy, that's the sort of thing that you can pick out instantly and go, that's a big change. And that's probably not the healthiest thing to do, but as scientists, we poke and prod people in unhealthy ways to learn from them. So that's how we get by on that one. And then well-being. So this particular metric is to do with my applied work through English Institute of Sport. And this is an athlete where we didn't have a huge amount of monitoring in place, but it was noticed that they were at an age where their performance should be increasing significantly, and they'd really plateaued and were showing some signs of overreaching, overtraining sort of syndrome. So to start monitoring that over time, just using well-being, so a series of questions around sleep duration, sleep quality, fatigue, irritability, motivation, readiness to train, these sorts of things, and then coming up with an overall well-being figure. It's a demonstration of measuring after the interesting things already happened, but you can tell by the upward trend over the course of looking at, coming up towards a year in that particular case. I think we've got about 8 months worth of data there. That upward trajectory of well-being. So the best thing which I can say off the back of that is get your baseline now, and then you can start to pick out when the interesting things are happening. And be totally honest with yourself. You're not the only person you're cheating, that if you are the sort of person who puts well-being as 7s every day, 7, 7, 7, yeah, fine, 7, 7, is that you won't learn about your own performance, your own training process, which is really, really valuable to do long-term, for your long-term development. So some key points. It seems like I don't know, to me it's an obvious one, but this is just a philosophy around training which I find very useful to adopt, is that the purpose of training is to create an opportunity for growth. The good stuff doesn't happen in training. The good stuff happens once you've created the opportunity for it. Appropriate recovery allows this opportunity to be realised. Determining normal and abnormal change in your well-being, performance and physiology allows you to learn and get the most out of your training in the long term. And I think if you can crack those things, that is treating cycling as a purely physiological sport. There is obviously the technical component to it, the strategic component to it, but the purpose of most training is down the physiological side. It's quite a physiologically heavily weighted sport. If you get that stuff nailed, that gives you a really, really good base to improve your performance over time. And that's me, but questions, violent disagreements, anything else at this stage, I'm more than open to. It'd be a useful forum to discuss.
Any questions particularly?
Yeah, Ben, can I just ask, obviously you've shown quite a few different graphs and charts there. How can the riders pull that information from of their own together, to sort of have monitor their own progress themselves? Is that sort of like a Training Peaks, or is that self-generated graphs and charts, or what?
Yeah, a lot of those are ugly scrap together graphs from bits of Excel work through PhD stuff. But Training Peaks is particularly useful if you go into rides and analyze bits. I think you have to be quite purposeful with it. You have to. That's where I think planning out stuff to look at in Zwift is quite nice, because then it automatically spits out the analysis that you're looking for. Some of the other bits that I showed around the resting physiology I have no association with this app, so I'm not pushing it on their behalf, but it is HRV for training or HRV for performance, one of those two.
Right.
Which a lot of the analysis is done basically by the app for you. It will create your normal ranges, and it will tell you when you're outside of those normal ranges with resting heart rate and heart rate variability.
Yeah.
So that's one that I use quite a lot for that side of it.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Okay. I think we had a question from Archie in the chat, and says, is resting heart rate of 52 BPM okay for a 54 kilogram 16-year-old? In terms of okay, I suppose, is that kind of within normal range? I think is what he's getting.
Yeah, it's strangely, resting heart rate's got a big genetic component. So whether it's okay or not is much more to do with change within yourself rather than compared to the rest of the population, the rest of the cycling population, and so on. But through studies, I've had World Tour riders with resting heart rates of 70, which is sort of normal range for general population, just healthy, not athletic. When you look at group averages, it's not the actual value that we're interested in, it's the change from that value in response to training. So with my conventional sort of group means hat on, 52 is an athletic resting heart rate for a cyclist. But in terms of how you're responding to training, if you were to do a couple of really hard days of training and you found that your resting heart rate in the morning was 60, that would be the interesting change that you've seen there, rather than the actual value itself. It's the change from your normal resting heart rate.
Great.
Ben, just on while Archie's brought up heart rates there, my lad's had quite an increase in his heart rate over the last couple of weeks in some of his training. And hit a high at the weekend on the academy session. Is there a measure or a norm? He's mentioned 220 less your age as a max. Is that and I was speaking to Heather about it, and she said that was, for normal people. Competitive cyclists are generally not very normal, a bit fitter. Is there another measure, or is there another indicator? He was looking at his numbers and thinking, Christ, I'm going to have a heart attack here. So he didn't. But is there a number there or not?
I sound like such a cop out for science in saying that 220 is a good general. 220 minus age is a general rule.
Yeah.
There's I don't know if you've come across on Twitter. There's or in real life, there's a scientist called Stephen Seiler, but he crowdsources a lot of his data.
Yeah.
And they had recently, as like an open submission questionnaire, athletes for their max heart rates and their ages to see if that held true.
Yeah.
And they got something like nearly 5,000 athletes of varying, levels of elite and recreational and whatever. And 220 minus age is exactly that. It's something which is probably sort of about there.
Yeah.
But you get some really, really, you get some people who are very wide of the mark. I speak as someone who fits exactly to that. However, I know that for my partner, say, it's completely wrong. And I've had cyclists before where their 220 minus age should have them sub 200 beats per minute.
Yeah.
And they have held over 215 beats per minute for sort of 5 minutes at a time. So it's, as a general rule, the important bit that I take out of it is, depending on how you're setting zones, if you have originally set them as 220 minus age, and then you find that either your max heart rate is considerably shy of that or is considerably north of that, make sure that the zones are set accordingly off the actual heart rate, because it opens up the opportunity to be working far too hard or work far too easy.
Yeah.
As a generalization. Yeah.
Okay.
Ben, as a measure of how tired you are using heart rate, I'm interested in what you said, that you may be able to repeat the same workload, say on a turbo trainer, using the same resistance or producing the same power when you're tired, but you'd expect to see a different heart rate. What sort of heart rate difference would you be looking at as an indication of being really tired for the same workload, fatigued against fresh?
As a rule of thumb, 10 beats per minute either way is very meaningful. Again, individual. If you track it over time, and if you see that you're always falling within 5 beats per minute, and you've got that over the course of 10 measurements, say, and then you see a change from week to week or day to day, where that's then going to sort of 7 or 8 beats per minute, that's meaningful for you. It's interesting to see that it can go either way. It's about that autonomic nervous system that we were mentioning before, and it's very sensitive to things like, if there is unfamiliar strength training, that can have a real effect on the autonomic nervous system, and you generally find that heart rate is higher for the same workload the next day, or even within a 24-hour period. If, on the other hand, there's been a long, low intensity session, you might find that it's generally less impactful, but you might find it on the lower side. But yeah, as a rule of thumb, 10 beats per minute, definitely meaningful. But it's best to discover what's meaningful for the individual, for your training, to see. There'll be a band where the values fall in, as long as you're good with calibrating the trainer fairly regularly as well. That can be a bit of a misleading factor in it.
So it could be 10 beats higher, or it could be 10 beats lower. It's just that it's 10 beats away from what you'd expect.
Yeah. It's with strength training as the example, that will generally take it higher. with a very common thing with real states of deep overreaching, moving into overtraining, is that you'll have this inability to increase heart rate appropriately. And it goes with, you see it across heart rate, you quite often see it across lactate as well. And the body just won't respond to it. It's largely driven by hormonal changes. Your body just can't necessarily produce the adrenaline or receive the adrenaline. The heart becomes less receptive to adrenaline as well. So everything that your legs is doing will say, increase the heart rate so that I can manage this. And the hormones aren't necessarily there to actually put it into action.
Oh, thanks. That's really interesting.
Any more questions from anyone? Right. Thanks very much, Ben. That's been really good 40 minutes there. Cheers. I'm sure I've learned a lot myself, so I'm sure everyone else has learned loads as well. Good to get some good questions as well. Let me just stop the recording.